Okay, perfect. I think we should get started. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to go through a couple of housekeeping items before I pass it over to Chris and Sharuk. The first thing is that this webinar is recorded and everybody will receive that recording after the event. And then the second thing was we do have a couple of polls available. So the first one will be available throughout the entire webinar, and then the second one will be available at the end. Just if you could answer those as honestly as possible, just so we can do the best follow-up we can for you, that would be amazing. So with that being said, I will pass it over to Chris and Sharuk.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everybody, wherever you're tuning in from, or maybe you're watching a re-recording, right, or a replay of this and just listening on it in the background. I'm excited today. I'm joined by Sharuk. We're going to be talking about maximizing your identity security and ROI. We have a bunch of different topics, but before we get into that, yes, we have some slides, but the idea really is to have more of a conversational piece about this, right? How can we relate? What can we talk about? And what are some key things you can take away? But before we dive into that, Sharuk, why don't you introduce yourself? Give us a little bit about your background and about Key Data.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. So Sharuk Hijazi, for those who don't know me, I'm a director at Key Data Associates, where we do all things identity, from privileged access to customer identity, workforce identity, and all the bolts around the consulting and the integration and managed services. But we're not here to give you any sort of sales pitch. I promise, Chris, this will be a very organic type of fireside chat talk. So more about me. I've been in the consulting field for almost 10 years. And actually, I did not start in identity. I did a little bit of a round between cybersecurity domains. So I did a little bit of vulnerability management, data protection, cyber strategy and transformation, and then landed into IAM. So it kind of gave me a good view of the different aspects of cyber before delving into pain points in identity. And really happy to be with you here, Chris, and kind of delve into the sort of benefits and metrics to look out for when it comes to identity and privileged access. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think we, for everybody, just so the awareness, right? We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what would be some really good talking points that people want to take away. We put a lot of thought behind the few slides. I say a few slides that we really want to, highlight. Some of them may be up longer. They are available as a handout. Really quick about me. So Chris Hills, Chief Security Strategist at Beyond Trust. I've kind of had a unique, journey in cybersecurity. I came from the practitioner side. Now I'm on the vendor side. I've been involved with privileged access management with Active Directory as a background since 2011. Since being here at Beyond Trust, going on 6 years now, I've held roles as Senior Solutions Architect, Deputy CTO, Deputy CISO, and now Chief Security Strategist. So one thing that often comes up when we do these in person is, hey, Chris, can I get a card? And I'm just like, they've changed my title so many times. I stopped printing cards after my second title change. So it's kind of funny. So I'm hoping that between the two of us, we really do not only have an organic, but the idea really is about, my apologies for not getting this back on the first slide for you, but it is about, maximizing your identity in, the ROI aspect. Some of the key pieces we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about breach discussion, right? We're going to talk about emphasis and importance about visibility. I cannot stress that enough, especially with what's going on around the world right now. We're going to kind of differentiate identity versus PAM, but also talk about the relationship that the two have. We'll talk about success metrics, and especially, Sharuk, from what you're seeing, working with customers, right? What is working, what's not working, maybe what some of the oversights, some of the pitfalls are. We'll talk about some strategy. We have some pretty cool key takeaways in regards to ROI strategy. And then, call to action. What are some of those pieces? So as we kind of set the stage, for those of you that pretty much get into any of my conversations or see my presentations, I always start off with what's going on around the world. Nobody is immune. Everybody is, essentially could be a target. It's all about opportunity, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world, as you'll see through some of the other stats and slides that I have. This is a global problem, whether we talk about COVID as a pandemic or we talk about threat actors as a pandemic preying on organizations and taking advantage of their weaknesses. And I'll highlight that here in a minute. What I like to, at the beginning of the year, Microsoft Blizzard, right? The App 29, a password spray attack, the fact of not having MFA, one of the most simplest things that you think of, MFA, not there, a dev environment that got access into a corp environment. That's huge. It's a huge oversight. What can you share, Sharuk, from your side, what you've seen, from let's say a significant breach impact that maybe not everybody knows about, but still has a significant impact?
I think in general, one thing people miss is that attackers are not necessarily looking for institutions that are loaded like banks and all the big enterprises anymore. You're starting to see a lot of attacks on the small and medium businesses, and folks get confused, like, what? Well, we don't have a lot of money. Why are they after us? And I think people miss the value of identity and data. Now in the market, a simple like username and email goes for maybe $2 if it's from a trusted source. And with volume, if you can have many of these aggregated, then you start to see that financial return on investment for the attacker. So I laugh when I hear things like, "Oh, Toronto Zoo got hacked the other day," and I'm like, "Really?" But it's real, right? It gives you perspective, and it's across all sectors. Like a bigger one that we recently had, just because I'm based in Toronto, and our neighbors in Hamilton had a pretty big ransomware attack that hit the city of Hamilton that shut down almost like all city phone lines. It paralyzed the like bus application, so transportation got impacted, library cards, permit applications, etc. And that cost alone $5.7 million just to respond to. That's not accounting for all the additional like legal and all the other costs. So it does have a huge impact, and everyone is I would say vulnerable.
Yeah, no, and I mean, when we kind of talk about that, I think you bring up a good point, right? I'm going to cover very briefly like the ransomware. What is the primary, means, the foothold that ransomware, attacks are being leveraged. But as we kind of dive into this, right, this is a recap. Again, stats, if you want to fact check me, IBM cost of a data breach report, here it is. This is just a much easier and digestible way of seeing this. I challenge organizations. We talk about total cost of ownership. We talk about ROI. We're going to get into that discussion. I challenge organizations and businesses, when you look at these top attack vectors, these are what are plaguing organizations right now. How are they being breached? What is the means that they're being breached? Number one, back at the top, right? Stolen and compromised credentials. It's easier for a threat actor to log in than hack in. But I go back to be like, how are we still at a state of stolen and compromised credentials? What is organizations not focusing on? And our CRO says that, he talks about doing the basics brilliantly. To me, password management, right? Credential management. And that could be human, non-human, right? It could be service account, CLI, API. What is it that organizations are not doing correctly that stolen and compromised credentials still are at the top? And then as you kind of go through this cascading, phishing is number 2. Last year it was number 1. Cloud misconfiguration was further down. It is back in the number 3 spot. And we talk about misconfiguration, lack of configuration. Look, at the end of the day, with as much cloud adoption that's going on, the lack of trained and skills, everybody's feeling that, vendor side, partner side, I'm sure, as you know. And it just continues. We have the vulnerability aspect. Okay, 0 days is one thing. How are we not protecting against 0-day vulnerabilities? And it kind of cascades into this, here's the top 10. The most costly, right? You talk about that 4 to 5 million cost of a data breach. There's the average cost, right? It's up 10%. This report spans across 16 countries and regions. So it's not just US, it's not just Canada, it's globally. And when you take the average of that, we're still at 4.88 million on average. And then the malicious insider peaks that, right? The malicious insider is the most costly attack vector. So how are you providing oversight? How are you providing guardrails? How are you providing maybe compliance or regulatory around your own internal employees? Are you trusting them? Are you giving them admin rights? Are you not managing a least privilege model correctly, right? And I get it, because a lot of organizations struggle, and we're going to get into some of that, with how do we do it? What is important? What are the KPIs? Where do I get the most ROI? What's staggering is when you look at the cost, or not cost, the amount of time it takes to not only identify when a breach occurs, but then to contain it is 258 days. And when you start peeling the layers of the onion back, what's interesting is that the stolen or compromised credential, which sits at the number one spot, it's actually 292 days, according to the report. So it really is interesting. And when we kind of talk about how are the breaches identified, right? We go back to, what are we focusing on? What's important versus what's not important? In all of these attacks, some of us may think, hey, you know what? We have the right tools in place. We have a SOC, or we have a security team in place. We're doing all the right things. But are you focused on the right pieces? Because when it comes to organizations' own security tools and their own teams, they're only catching 42% of the breaches that are out there. That, to me, is mind-blowing. So, when we talk about this landscape, I'm going to hide the slides here. When we talk about this landscape and what's going on, Sharuk, from your perspective, helping customers, where's the struggles, right? Why are these continuously popping up and we're not seeing new attack vectors being leveraged, AI and all this other stuff? How is it that you're, when you work with customers and organizations, what's missing? What's the key element? What are you finding that they need the most amount of help with in order to get that ROI?
Great question. I think you put it in the slides earlier. It's pretty consistent what the pattern is. It's not something that clients don't know about. For example, remote escalation or remote access. That's a big, huge threat attack. But they don't necessarily have the capacity to prioritize these like quick wins, for example, because there are a lot of things going on in an organization, and you have conflicting priorities. So I think the number one question I often get asked by clients, like, I know what's missing, but how do I prioritize from this long laundry list of things that I have to get done by end of the year? So I think the first step is, aside from acknowledging what the problem is really going back to leadership and saying, like, these are the priorities. Are you on board with them? And what can we achieve as a quick win? Because a lot of people wait for the perfect security, which never happens, at the expense of good, quick win that can reduce the risk, because it'll never be 100% risk-free. It's a matter of what level of risk are you willing to accept. And for me, having that, what I see often missing is that roadmap that clearly tells the execution team, the operations team, what to do in the short term so that you can get to that long-term vision with all the fancy schmancy tools. And you hit on AI in your question, because now everyone is also trying to leverage, and as well as attackers, it's kind of two-edged sword, in the sense that we're seeing now attackers leverage that to mine which companies may have some cloud accounts that are left with over permissions and just left without being used, and they have these capabilities now to do it with little to no effort. You got, speaking of ransomware earlier, you got all these gangs and like Lockbit and others that really sell all these RAS, like ransomware as a service, essentially a kit that you can buy for a few dollars and be able to attack companies. So having now this technology to be able to easily attack would also mean for companies to counteract and have to leverage similar tools of the same advancement to be able to use it to their advantage. And we're seeing a lot of it now on the identity and privileged access management side, whether it's using AI to help with analytics for your footprint, to quickly discover privileged permissions out there for you to be able to quickly get a hold of who has access to what, and be able to even have someone tell you whether someone should have access or not without having to go through hoops and ask, does this person need access to this? Does that person know what to do with this account, and so forth? If you can automate that using these technologies, that also allows you to get through a lot of these quick wins. So I hope that makes sense. It's essentially focusing on what technologies can I use to accelerate quick wins, and how can I prioritize action items so I can get something done rather than wait for longer time until everything is perfect, at which point it might be too late.
Yeah, no, and it's funny because we keep talking about how the landscape changes, but the attack vectors have remained the same, right? And when we talk about the identity, how it relates to privilege, how it relates to entitlements, at the end of the day, while the landscape changes, AI is probably the biggest landscape change that we've seen, next to the ransomware as a, post-pandemic, fallout. But the stats still point back to identity. And whether you look at where we were in 2018 with network perimeter and security, and then we kind of went away from that as people started working more remotely. I hate to bring up COVID and the pandemic, but it is what it is. We focused on endpoint security, and now we're being interconnected, with cloud resources and connections, and businesses connecting to cloud resources, and end users no longer protected by that network boundary. Now we have to focus on how do we protect that identity. And so while the landscape has changed, the focal point of the identity, the privileges associated with the identity is kind of, you've heard, if you've been on any journey with us, we talk about the path to privilege, we talk about identity security, and now we talk about the identity fabric stack that traverses everything from, the business objectives and how the lines of business work, to the relationships associated in the identity fabric, and how all of those now need to work cohesively to create those workflows for all these interconnections. At the root, as you've seen in the stats, the identity still is the thing you have to protect the most. And then with the identity, do they have the right privileges? Are they overprivileged? Now, as cloud continues to grow, what about entitlements? I've always said the cloud problem is essentially the on-prem problem exacerbated in the cloud, and it's more convoluted. It's much harder to manage. It's much harder to see and have visibility across where all those entitlements are. And I think that kind of brings up, you mentioned ransomware, and I'm just going to touch on this slide just for a second. But for organizations that are still embarking and truly believe that VPN is the most secure thing, which hopefully not everybody does, when you look at this is a Coveware statistic. This is Q2 2024. When you kind of go through this and look at it, remote access compromise is still, when it comes to known categories, right? I know that they added a new unknown, and it pikes up there. But remote access is the number one category. And that doesn't matter whether it's third party, whether it's vendor, whether it's supply chain. Remote access compromise is the number one attack vector related to ransomware. You talked about, in Canada and where they have that most recent breach, the zoo, right? When you look at that and you start to understand, the statistics point back to, and all the forensics, if you go and read the report, point back to organizations VPN as being the number one source for the compromise. So what does that tell you about VPN? Yes, it's going to cost more money. Yes, you need to invest in, I hate to say better security, but the threat actors are getting smarter. To your point, you mentioned AI. And before we kind of get into the next slide, where we kind of talk about the ROI and the KPIs that you put together, which, there's a lot of great data, and I want you to walk everyone through it. Let's talk about AI really quick, and, how is and how will AI impact identity and privilege? And I know we're starting to see the onset of that now, Obviously we know about the chat GPTs. For those of you that didn't know about the Samsung breach, really quick, I don't want to say it's a funny story, but 2 engineers didn't know how to write a config file. They turned to chat GPT. They were engineers at Samsung. They had chat GPT write the config file, host name, IP, all the data. It was in public, large language model, right? That data is free to use and leverage. They implemented it. Samsung got breached. So there's implications of AI that go into that. Now we're starting to see organizations glean off of that, pick their own AI models, train their own AI models, but we haven't even gotten into a path of how do you protect those models? How are the users that are accessing it? Can they alter it based upon their input and the output? Or is that restricted just to the developers to continue training it? One of the interesting things in the report states that organizations that are leveraging vendors and solutions that have AI baked into them and are using it as a point of risk reduction, on average, can reduce the cost of a breach up to 2.2 million. That's huge. So while we focus on the negative sides of AI, there is a positive side when it comes to visibility, where the risks are, how to identify the risk in a much quicker fashion. What can you share in regards to what you're seeing, how customers, are embarking, how Key Data is leveraging AI to help customers bridge this gap in this journey to realize where, hey, here's what's important. Here's what you need to focus on. Here's where your risks are.
Yeah, definitely. And we're seeing it in a lot of areas across privileged access management and identity security overall. If you look at all the tools nowadays, every customer is asking which one has some AI configured or built in so that I don't have to do extra steps to deploy or to do that. So part of it is from the solution perspective, having AI capabilities to let's say provide privileged threat insights. I think that's the biggest one we're seeing today. Having different tools augment your XDR or your SIM and overall, because in the past you had to rely on static ingestion of logs, whereas now there are smart tools and smarter ways of detecting patterns so that someone doesn't have to sit through going seeing all these logs. Instead, they can have an AI engine to complement that and tell them like, hey, this is a privileged threat. Because there are a lot of use cases and a human being can only focus on so many before something gets lost through the cracks. So having AI complement the threat analytics piece has been really popular recently, and having the ability to target specific use cases. So when we talk about PAM, how do we know which of the users are really in the middle of, let's say, an attack chain, and which of these failed logins are truly compromising your security. So that's one aspect. The other is just overall from transformation project, we're seeing customers now looking to AI to clean up data, because that's a big source of pain point for a lot of customers starting their identity journey, because you can't really have any sort of identity governance or handle on what access you have unless you have clean data source. And as you know, big data is a problem for everyone. So having AI to clean that and be able to tell you this is the user that has access to or should have access to something based on roles. Like this is not a technical problem. It's more of a just data cleanup problem, and having a way to complement the efforts for, let's say, HR teams and folks who are trying to get clean data for security team to leverage. AI has been introduced recently to help a lot with that. And it goes on and on. I mean, the list, you talked about the 2 engineers who went to ChatGPT for coding. And that's a prime example. A lot of folks are trying to embed that into their day-to-day, whether that's configuring, who wants to configure a connector from scratch? Now you just want that template, and it does have its advantages. So now you no longer expect to wait for months before a customized connector is in production. You could do it in a much faster approach. It's just a matter of how do you do it securely and how do you manage that risk so that you're leveraging the tools and the technology in a safe way.
No, and you brought up a good point. You focused on AI, the fact of identity privilege. And I think one of the important things here to mention for those that maybe have heard about it, maybe don't know about it, or maybe are well invested in it, the ITDR category, right? Identity threat detection and response. And so when we talk about the ITDR category, there's several of us in there. We are one of them, among some of the others. And the interesting thing there really is about how a lot of us are leveraging AI to help uncover. One of the key pieces that I think is important to understand is a lot of the solutions that are out there that are in place when we look at the identity fabric, right? Whether it's a SSO, whether it's a MFA, whether it's an IGA type solution, right? And so on and so forth, access management type solutions. All of those pieces are designed to work essentially independently. Yes, they have integrations. There's never been really oversight. And to your point you made, hey, we rely on SIM data, on event data being sent to the SOC. SOC has to be configured. We have to know what to look for. And now your SOC team has that needle in a haystack. How do we find that needle in a haystack when there is a risk, or when somebody's doing something nefarious, or maybe something as simple as a misconfiguration? Somebody didn't have an MFA similar to the Midnight Blizzard and the spray attack. The idea behind it now in the ITDR category is to provide insight and overlook on the identity aspect of that. And so for anybody who has looked at that category, maybe they haven't, maybe it's something new, I encourage you, look at that ITDR category, because that is going to be that stepping stone relative to, I don't want to say replacing the SOC, but it really is, it gets away from that known bad that a SIM and event data is known for. And now it's a matter of uncovering, where's my risk? Where's the misconfigurations, right? That could potentially lead to a breach or a compromise. It's more of that oversight. And the beauty of it is that it spans across that identity fabric, all of access management. And so when we kind of talk about this, you put together a really cool slide. And so I want to definitely give you an opportunity to talk about this. This is kind of the heart, which is kind of falls about the middle of this. ROI. Everybody wants to know what they are. I just got on a call yesterday, believe it or not, with a company in New Zealand, and it was about cyber insurance. They want the smoking gun. How much money can I save if I implement XYZ solution on my policy? And, I think everybody in every industry is a little bit different. Not everyone's the same. You can't approach everyone the same. You have this beautiful slide, this beautiful model, but ideally everybody focuses on a different piece with a little more emphasis on what is my high priority versus what is my low priority. So I would love for you to kind of go through this and share with the audience building risk, right? You talk about informed metrics, what's important. What can you share about this, and how can you help educate those that are listening to really help drive this home and what they need to potentially look at?
Yeah, what you're looking at here is a general framework, right, that you could take and then apply to the different values that matter to most to your organization. Because each organization, to your point, may care about something. One may be driven by insurance. One might be more interested in operations. So this is the higher level framework to really look at the ROI from identity security in generally, if I had to bucket them 3 ways. One angle is risk aversion. And that's where you address KRIs or look at how identity security controls would reduce the risk. And generally, that's where in the slide here, you see things like security breaches and compliance. That's where you start thinking about, if I implement this tool, I'm going to be then looking at metrics like the number of inactive privileged users, or the number of over-permissioned accounts on the cloud, or how is my password compliance, like number of passwords that haven't changed, let's say in the last year or two. These are the metrics that would then drive the sort of quantified benefit of having controls that would address these metrics and reduce the security risk of it. The other part would be not necessarily a security risk, but a compliance risk. So having metrics around tracking the benefit of not having to pay, let's say, $300K for violation fees. That's the average number that Canadian organizations that are found in violation would have to pay for, and actually North America in general, for compliance violations. So that's a risk that you have to think through. And on the other hand, it's a benefit, because if you're mitigating that risk, then that's quantifiable benefit that you could take to leadership and say, these are the risks I'm saving you from, essentially. So that's one angle that I usually try not to start with. I'm starting from the bottom up here, the security and compliance, because at the end of the day, you don't want to scare people off. You don't want to say, hey, you have to implement this tool because you're otherwise you're going to pay this much money in because of security breaches or compliance. The one I like more, the second angle, which is business driven. So that's where we look at KPIs that actually show benefits to the end users. So this could be what you look at here at the top, like operational or end user driven. So from an operation perspective, you may want to track metrics like how many identities I'm able to automatically provision, or faster provisioning, like how long it was taking me before when I was doing manual steps to now how long I can quickly do it. Or in the context of PAM, how long it was taking me to manually rotate certain passwords, and now I can have a tool that does it for me automatically in the background. How long was it taking me to do access requests for my end users versus how quick now when it's automated. So that's the kind of efficiency driven metrics that I would love for organizations to quantify. And the other part is end user experience, because when you want to show business value, you want to show how is that impacting the end user positively. You could see a lot of that, for example, when it comes to self-services. So enabling the end user to now do things and do reset, and even on the privilege side, having that freedom to be able to elevate their privileges whenever they need to complete their actions without having to go through hoops and approvals and so forth through these secure channels and security controls. One of my favorite stories actually was the way that one of my clients implemented EPM, because everyone thinks about endpoint management as something you want to restrict users for. But for this client, it was actually the opposite, because before they were scared of a security breach and therefore completely removed any sort of admin privileges on the user's machine. So any end user would not be able to do anything on their laptop. They took away all admin control. But then imagine how frustrating that would be for end users that are doing like development or doing all these administrative tasks. So when we introduced that concept of, hey, like EPM, it wasn't looked at from a lens of it's a security control that will reduce risk. It was looked at, oh, this is finally going to give my end users the freedom to do what they need to do on a daily basis to be able to elevate and administer in a secure, risk mitigated way. So that's like the positive spin to it. And then, so aside, like we talked about risk aversion as one angle, the business driven, another angle. The third that I like to just quickly mention is cost reduction. And that's a fair angle to look at the ROIs as well, because sometimes you're just doing it to save on insurance premiums or save on help desk costs. Because if you can just automate some of these processes, maybe you don't have to have 10 people on the help desk to take calls. So having that sort of cost reduction angle would also help. Typically, I like to use all three in the way I would present ROI on a project, so that you can resonate with different people, because different people are driven by different metrics.
No, I think that's good. And I think, even though I'm on the vendor side, right? I think part of the problem is that, hey, here's a shiny new, it's a buzzword, it's a shiny new tool. We need that because, it's the latest, greatest. And instead of taking a risk-based approach, right? What is important to us? The first piece is being able to identify what risks do we have, and then how do we address those risks? And is that going to help us with compliance, with regulatory? Is that going to help us with potential breaches, right? With risk mitigation. Sorry, I'm tongue tied this morning. Or is it, are we focused on the end user experience? We all know that if end users don't like it, they're going to kick and scream and not use it, and they're going to fight. And, so user adoption is huge. And a lot of time, one of the biggest pain points is getting the behavior of the user adoption to accept the type of, security tools or processes and procedures that you're putting in place. And then you have the operational efficiency side. What is the board looking at, right? What are the executive leadership looking at as far as how the business is operating? Really quick on this slide before we move on, what do you feel, I don't want to say that organizations get wrong, but what do you feel is overlooked the most that maybe you can give as an insight that maybe organizations need to take a step back and look at it in a different way that potentially, it gets missed?
I think simplicity typically gets missed, and the beauty of having central visibility is undervalued, I would say. Oftentimes I hear folks jumping into, okay, how can I track the number of accounts that are managed and adding controls over. Controls are great, fantastic that you're securing your accounts, but what are you like? Do you know what's out there?
Sure.
Before you start implementing controls, because you're so focused on managing the accounts that you're aware of that you miss the bigger picture. What accounts am I not aware of? What is out there? And having that centralized visibility, as simple as it sounds from an ROI perspective, like, okay, sure, what am I getting when I see a dashboard? I want to just be able to do the next step. But for me, that base is where you start, and having an inventory of accounts and identities, not just account, because accounts is only one part. How do we correlate it to have an owner? Because when you have a large organization with a lot of system accounts, a lot of times you don't have that simple governance of who owns this machine account or like app to app account. So having that central view of, here are my identities, here are the accounts they own or have access to. Even if we're not even securing anything at that point, I still would call that a win and a return on investment in its own.
No, that's, and so, as we kind of move on, we talk about accounting, end-to-end life cycle. And I think, when at the beginning, when I said the relationship between identity and privilege, what is the difference versus how do they correlate? I think, this kind of talks about that life cycle, understanding and having oversight, the visibility, ensuring that not only identity and access management follows a life cycle, but also the privilege portion of that, right? The idea of following a least privilege model, ensuring that the privileges, yes, there's one thing for the identity to be there, but as people move within an organization, as people leave an organization, are those privileges, whether they're human or non-human, are those APIs, are those CLIs, are those keys properly managed? And so, one of the pieces that we wanted to talk about, the relationship between PAM, the KPIs for PAM, and then identity and access management, identity-centric KPIs, and are they similar? How do they aggregate, right? What can you share about this aspect?
Yeah, they're pretty much two sides of the same coin. I mean, they're part of the bigger picture of identity security. And sometimes you will have metrics that are specific to privileged access, but other times they apply to both. So just to not confuse anyone, when we were talking about IAM, we're just generally talking about the identity of users and who are standard users, that the average Joe that have access to email and certain business applications. Whereas when we're talking about PAM, we're talking about a subset of that user population that, in addition to having their regular access, they also have elevated permissions that a standard user won't, like your IT administrator, or maybe someone in finance with access to your entire payroll. When we talk about PAM, it's sometimes a subset, and it goes hand in hand with IAM when it comes to metrics. Often I find that a lot of the metrics can overlap when we're measuring the progress of MFA, for example, like how many are going or covered by MFA controls or phishing resistant, especially MFA controls. You're not going to look just at privileged users as much as we want to secure those. There are some things you want to take into the full population and roll out for the company. Similarly, when we're talking about identity governance, like how important it is to remove access when someone leaves or when someone gets terminated. They obviously want to do that much faster, quicker for privileged users, so there is no residual risk, but you still count that as an IAM control. So the lines get blurred when it comes to ROI, from my opinion. As long as you're capturing both holistically, that's what matters. If you have overlap, that's perfectly normal. The slide you're seeing here is just looking at what processes do we want to consider when we're looking at metrics, because oftentimes the question is like, how do I come up with metrics? I usually tell folks, start with your processes. So if you look at from a privileged access management, having discovery of accounts, so that can get you into metrics around the number or percentage of accounts you're covering. Then you talk about like onboarding, and then you start talking about the governance of not just machine identities, but also human identities and privilege access reviews. It's similar to just like any identity access review. You want to track potentially how quickly or how efficiently you're doing these, so that you're having detective controls, not just preventative controls, because oftentimes there's a lot of emphasis on let's prevent the attack, but you also want to make sure there are some detective controls out there, and all the way to offboarding. So once you start thinking about the life cycle from end to end, how does a user and then how does an account go through the motions in the lifetime of an identity in an organization? Then you start at each of these processes extrapolating a little bit of metrics, a little bit of ROI, and putting that bigger picture that we saw earlier together.
Yeah, no, and it's funny because, at the beginning we talked about the average cost of a breach. And I kind of laugh about that, because when we talk about, your return on investment, at the end of the day, assuming that everyone is following, a good strategy, a good plan, right? The ROI is the fact of you're not going to have to pay out that 4.88 million, right, on average. So that's the big picture. But then how do you break that into chunks? And, as we kind of shift gears in this last 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, and we start looking at the identity attack chain, we talk about everything that we talked about, right, really has been a focal point, which you see on this slide is the shift left. The idea behind this is not a new slide. This actually goes back to the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. It's the anatomy of an attack. It's how a threat actor, all of the steps that a threat actor must do in order to breach an organization, whether you go through and you look at the internal threats, the external threats, the execution of malware, identity theft, right? You get the lateral movement, probing for more privilege, more access. Then you have that exfiltration of data. Are they going to ransom it, right? And then are they going to steal that PII, PHI, and are they going to turn around and sell it? We're doing this for the most part, right? You mentioned EPM, which truly helps in that lateral movement. We're doing vulnerability well. So when you go in that shift left and you look at that top category, most of those are handled in a pretty good fashion still. Where we're seeing the breaches and where, again, the top attack vectors, the identity attack vectors. Identity is the biggest key piece here, right? Identity and access strategy. How are companies embarking on managing that identity and access strategy? And that's where we start to get into the bigger picture of identity security, which blankets the identity fabric, all of those layers within the house. I call it the house of identity and access management, but it's all of those, business requirements of the IGAs, of the MFAs, of the access management tools, of the PAM tooling, right? All of those pieces are where the threat actors are now lurking which is this shift left mentality. So, one of the questions that we have in here that we kind of talked about is, where does zero trust find its place in this? And I think, right, we talk about identity is the new perimeter, and it shows this based upon those perimeters. What can you share really quick about the zero trust journey that maybe customers need to understand from an ROI perspective?
Yeah, for me, zero trust is not a single goal or a checklist. I think the biggest misconception is clients thinking, do you have a list of controls that I could just implement like a project and then I can check off the box and I'm done? It's not really that way. To me, it's a framework or a philosophy of how you would go about your security principles, and it applies on multiple layers, right? We often see it at the network level, but then from our perspective, we focus on it from the identity level, and there's no right or wrong. There collectively, there are so many layers where you can apply that zero trust mentality. So at the network level, you talked earlier about VPNs. That is like the classic example that people are moving away to zero trust network architecture, so that you're no longer under the impression that, hey, if a user is on the internal network, then yeah, they can be trusted. That myth has long, been changed, and now folks are looking at, where is the user? Let's focus on their side of the house and make sure that the controls are all the way at the end user level, so that no matter where they're coming from, not from the internal network, they're still protected. And that kind of shifts into the identity centric approach that you mentioned earlier. Identity is the new perimeter. And you can apply the same exact concept of zero trust, meaning I'm not trusting the user until they prove themselves over and over again, and doing that intelligently. So you've traditionally had someone just go through VPN once, and then they have access to all the internal applications, and that no longer applies. They're coming from remote sites, and you want to protect that, but then you also want to apply it to have that zero trust mentality. You want to be able to first, from the get-go, be able to prove them in a way that's adaptive, what we typically call like adaptive MFA or adaptive access, because you don't want the user to be bombarded with MFA or MFA fatigue, where they have to prove themselves. Just because you believe in zero trust doesn't mean like you have to tell the user to prove themselves every single hour, right? So how do we do that intelligently so that we don't get to the user frustrated and get MFA fatigue, which can have the opposite impact, so that they're just clicking yes to an attacker. Similarly, if we go past that initial like user protection and endpoint protection, when we talk about the example of VPN accessing all the internal assets, we want to shift away from that to say, what does the user or the identity need access to exactly, and manage that so that you're giving user the principle of least privilege, just exactly the amount of access they need to get to that particular access. It's not like free game for all once you're inside the network. And obviously, when we talk about like privileged access management, a huge asset would be with that zero trust control framework, the just-in-time sort of control, and making sure that, hey, you, even if you need access, doesn't mean you need to have an account with permanent access to it. How about we give you provision and deprovision just in time to allow you to get that access when you need it. So these are just some examples of how I would view that zero trust in as a framework, if you will.
Sure. No, and I think you bring up a good point, right? One of the focal points has always been like ROI. Where's the ROI? And I think one of the takeaways from this particular subject, right, with zero trust is zero trust inherently, whether you're doing all 7 tenets, whether you're on a journey to achieve some form of zero trust within your organization, there is an ROI factor associated with it, right? It's risk reduction. That is the ROI factor at the end of the day. And knowing that your organization is secure, and then being able to quantify that. I kind of wanted to, when we talk about a strategy and we talk about, what are some of the pain points, there's pitfalls. It's easy to blame, right? The first step is making sure you have a solid plan at the end of the day, understanding where your risks are, and then developing that plan. The other piece of that, you mentioned it, is the user experience, understanding the needs of the user base or the lines of business, because the lines of business are the user base. Ideally, when we start thinking about users, we start thinking about individuals, and we forget about the overall business as a user in itself. And then, we get to a point where we've seen it time and time again. Organizations try to boil the ocean, right? And so when we see that happen, instead of getting one or two things right, you get everything wrong. So the focus, is don't look at the big picture. I always tell everybody, look at the big picture as more of a program, and then break that program into smaller bite-sized chunks, right? Into projects, things that you can easily digest, whether that is the discovery process, whether that is the risk and mitigation process, whether that is the continuous monitoring process. The idea is to take smaller bites, so that way you can get the ROI, you can get the KPIs. It's easier to report and kind of go back to. And then lastly, understand where your weaknesses are as an organization. Do you have the right staffing? Do you have the right knowledge base? Do you have the right skill set to get you to that end goal, and making sure you're not biting off more than you can chew in order to get there with the right talent or the right partner, right? In your case, when you kind of get to that. And when we build, as to your point, right, the roadmap, an actionable roadmap, here's kind of a great idea when we start looking at, of course, we're talking about identity, we're talking about privilege. So, I would be doing a disservice if I just put this as an overall blanket from a security program. But when it comes to applying, the principles of identity and privilege, what looks good, how to apply it, what does that time frame look like? Whether it's, the discovery, the vaulting, the management. Hey, great. What's the maturity life cycle of that? Where do we get additional ROI? That's the first piece of an ROI that I don't think people understand. You have to know what's out there before you can even start to gauge where that ROI is in that, and what you're going to do to capitalize or to make the ROI justifiable. What is important, right, for that return on investment? And it truly is baby steps. If you go straight to discovery and say, hey, we're going to go straight to threat analytics. Well, hold on a second. Where's the data to get to the threat analytics, and what are you doing with it first? So I think this provides a really good roadmap, in retrospect to that, and not to, muddy the water. But when we talk about, you mentioned it on your slide, right? This is kind of a slide I put together to give people kind of maybe a deeper dive into what are the PAM use cases? Where does the workflow look like? I wish I could take credit for these. But I can't. I just made them pretty. But it really is, it is an evolution. And at the end of the day, understanding where those pieces are, how to address them, right? It's that process and that journey to get to, that end state. Nobody wants to be breached, right? Anybody here that's on the call, whether you've been breached or you haven't been, I've always told everybody, I think it's a sad state that we're in, that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It doesn't have to be when. We need to do the preventative measures. And sometimes that's hard, whether it's budget, whether it's skill set, whether it's doing more with less. And so there's always these speed bumps, right? You saw the pitfall, the guy trying to walk across. There's always going to be speed bumps along the way. And that could be with tooling, that could be with skill set, that could be with user adoption. There's several pieces of this. What I did want to spend at least a minute on here, I'm going to kind of jump through this. For those of you that are watching, this is a great key mitigation. I will say they just dropped the Gartner Magic Quadrant. We're on the Magic Quadrant. We're still in the top right for the 6th year running, Peer Insights. But what I wanted to spend the last few minutes on, this is near and dear to you, Sharuk. And so talk to the audience right now as kind of a closing, right? What are the next steps? What should they focus on, and what's important? Did we lose you?
No, sorry.
There we go. Okay, I was like,
audio issues. It was like hard to unmute. There are really a couple of points we wanted to just leave you with here. First, reflection on what we just discussed. I think quick takeaways or highlights. We talked about, like, PAM is an identity. It's not just about risk reduction. It's about presenting it as a business enabler. So some questions to reflect on is, do you know how to how to get that messaging across? Have you gotten the most value out of your PAM or IAM solution? Are you able to convey these business enablers to leadership to make a business case for further growth? We talked also about the threat landscape. It's changing. We talked earlier about how like remote access is one of the top attack vectors. Ask yourself, like, are you staying up to date on what these threat landscapes are? Do you have an understanding of the complexity of hybrid infrastructure? And I'm sure everyone is on some journey to cloud. How is that impacting your security strategy? And lastly, when we talked about the metrics and all the different aspects of ROI, really at the heart of it is, are we able to have a list of smart, like measurable metrics that match the leadership's expectations in terms of business, and are they driving, like, can you quantify them and put dollar signs on each metric so that you can speak the language of the business and show how you're able to secure them in a way that resonates? So these are some questions that I would encourage you to reflect on, and if you have struggle with any of them, please feel free to reach out. I think as part of the poll, there was a question on whether you'd like a follow-up. You have myself, you have Beyond Trust. It's a fantastic tool to consider when it comes to privileged access management. We're not going to do a sales pitch, as we mentioned earlier, but just putting it out there. Feel free to reach out to us. We don't bite. So if you're looking to align on a roadmap, or looking to answer any of these questions as you reflect on what we discussed today, that's the goal.
No, and I think you bring up a good point, right? We can't do this alone. We rely heavily on our partners, such as yourself, as a consultant phase, right? I come from the customer world, practitioner. I know, I hate to say this, right? The used car salesman. Sales folks are focused on sales, right? We rely on our partners truly to convey that consulting message, to help our customers in their journey uncover things that either, one, they didn't realize that they had, as far as risks, and two, point them in the right direction that is truly going to help drive them to the success and the area that they want to get to when it comes to their security posture. That really is a great point of our partners working in that consultative state. Yes, they can recommend solutions. We're a partner with you, but at the end of the day, one of the reasons why I came to work for this company is the customer focus, is the partnership, understanding the pain points, understanding the needs, and not just recommending products because we want to sell products, right? And we want to line our pockets. It really is about the investment in our customers, the investment in our partners, and our partners with our customers, and having that trusted advisor in your corner to truly call out, help the customers achieve that security maturity in their journey to secure their organization. So with that being said, Sharuk, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I know we're at the top of the hour. Sarah, I welcome you back to kind of help close us out, launch that last poll. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope there's some takeaways, whether it's in the slides, whether it's some of the points that we made, but I hope everyone has a great day. And again, thank you, Sharuk, for joining me today and kind of talking about this identity journey with ROI and KPIs. And Sarah, go ahead and take it away. Close us out.
Did we lose Sarah?
I know, right? Sarah. Watch, she's still on mute. She doesn't realize.
All good.
Let's see. I'll launch the poll. Hopefully the poll launches.
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe she had technical difficulties, so my apologies. I will launch the poll. We'll let that stay up for the next few minutes. Feel free to grab the handouts, right? There's a couple different things there. If for some reason you'd like a copy of the slides, right? If for some reason they don't open, you didn't get to them, maybe there's certain things you want, feel free to reach out. I have the coolest email in our company. It's chills@beyondtrust.com. Yeah, send me an email, right? Tell me you'd like a copy of the slides for today's presentation. More than happy to share them with you. And, that'll be great. So I will go ahead and close this out. And again, thanks everyone for joining, and hope you have a great day.